Hello everyone, my name is Marta and I'm super excited to be a part of this virtual conference, Connect.Tech. I'm a huge fan of progressive web apps, and today I will tell you about offline first in Angular. This is a strategy for progressive web apps, and it's really important to remember that the main factor that tells you if it's worthy to progressively enhance your app into PWA is the character of your data. If you have static data, static assets that you can easily cache, it's quite easy to create progressive web apps. But if you have more interactions between client and server, it's more difficult. It can be challenging to you to create app that is fresh but also work perfectly while offline. Today I will tell you how you can store your data locally on the front-end side, what are options for you, and how you can synchronize it with the backend automatically, make your app fast and stable while the network isn't. Now let me introduce myself. My name is Marta Wiśniewska. I'm Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies. I'm from Poland. I live in Warsaw. I work as a front-end developer at NES, and I'm a huge fan of Angular, progressive web apps, open source. I co-create PWA Fire. This is an open source project that allows you to start your journey with progressive web apps. If you're interested, you can visit this page and also check profile on Twitter. I love all things about tech. I love also coffee, sport, and community. If you want to keep in touch, if you want to follow news about progressive web apps, you can find me on Twitter with this username. Today, the goal for me is to help you understand offline first approach, but I also want to show you how a huge impact developers have on human lives. Because maybe sometimes you feel like the frog from the picture, that something happens too many times to you, again and again, and regardless of what you do. Do you know that? Or maybe sometimes it's not too bad, but then it is, and you feel totally unstable, dangerously unstable, like, I don't know, like this. Or maybe even as simple things totally frustrate you. Typically small, moving, loading things. Do you know that? As you know, the stress, the negative energy has a huge impact on us, and a bunch of scientists were trying to find a solution how to make people happier. They were working on human brains, and it was totally surprising because they discovered that the only one way to make people happier is to create fast and stable apps and use offline first. So let's talk about it. In general, it means that offline state should not be an error condition. This is additional state to handle in your app. And at the beginning, you should create app that is able to render while offline. And then you can add more features. You can make it more powerful while it's online. But the more we can render without the connection, the better for us and our users. And I suppose that you already know that, but maybe not from web apps, but typically from desktop apps or mobile apps. If you're using Spotify, the native version, and you're offline, you're not able to track music, but you're able to edit playlists, do stuff like that. And when you have internet access again, then your data is synchronized with all your clients. Another example, if you're using Slack, desktop version, and you're offline, you're not able to send message, but this app's still working, and you're informed about offline state. So that's the main idea. But what we do in web apps, we store our data locally on the front-end side, we cache it and show that to the user, and at certain times we synchronize it with the backend, fetch new data, and store new data. So from your perspective, as a developer, you should write your app and assume that you don't have internet access again. And when your app works offline, then you can implement more features while it's online. There's a lot of advantages of this approach, and the first one is quite obvious, that you can actually create apps that work offline. But there's more. You can, for example, create faster user interfaces. In offline first, all your CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete, are moved locally on the front-end side. Typically, we apply the app shell model, so you're able to render the user interface of your app really quickly. Also, we can cache network resources. We don't need to wait for response from the server, but we can easily return it to your user. It will improve the performance of your app, but also will give you better user experience. And from other perspective, you can inform your users about the offline state and about the state of your network, so it also improves the experience of your users. And the last point, we can fetch network requests periodically versus all the time, so you can save bandwidth and also improve battery life of your device. What are golden rules of offline first? First one, we should use local data whenever possible. When we use resources from the internet, we use XML HTTP request to get it and then save the data locally. We have few options to store your data in a browser. It can be Chrome Storage API, index database, session storage, local storage, and so on. And about these options, different alternatives, their pros and cons, I will tell you in the next few slides. The second point, we should separate user interface of your app from its data. Now you have different MVC frameworks, and they can really help you keep this data and user interface separated. And this method is really important because it will improve design of your app, but also it will ease the task of enabling offline usage. The point number 3 is we should store the state of your app locally and remotely if it's possible, to allow your users pick up wherever they left off. And the last point about testing, so you should make sure that your app works properly. It should work in common tricky scenario, and also you should test app while offline and online, just to check if it renders while offline, check your features if they work properly while online, and also test it for different scenarios for your users. Now I want to tell you about offline storages, because it's a key point to understand offline first approach. Here you can see basic options, and I assume that you already know that, maybe even if you're not familiar with progressive web apps. So session storage allows you to store data in a browser for the duration of page session, as long as the browser is open and including page reloads and restores. Local storage can do the same thing, but even you can store your data if you close and reopen your browser. These storages have limits if you're talking about of max capacity, and it's different for different browsers. But for your Firefox, Chrome, and Opera, this limit is 5 MB per domain. And these options are quite common, but also have downsides. And the first one, they are synchronous, what means that they can block your app. From the other perspective, they don't have support for web worker, and we also need to serialize and deserialize data because they can store only strings. WebSQL is a bit better because it's asynchronous, so it's based on callbacks, but it also doesn't work with web worker, and the browser support is not too good. It was rejected, for example, with Firefox and Edge, but you can able to use it with Chrome and Safari. So let's switch our focus on alternatives. So these storages are able to work with web workers. So for example, you can use File System API that is asynchronous, so it will not block your app and will work with web workers. But to be honest, it doesn't have much interest outside of Chrome, and it's sandboxed, which means that you can't get native file access. File API were created for representing file objects in web apps, and you're able to use interfaces like file list interface, blob interface, or file interface. But from practical perspective, in offline first and progressive web apps, we use these options. We use index database and cache API. Index database is NoSQL database that can store pairs of key and value. It supports case storage, and it allows you to store different types of data. It can be strings, JSON, number, blob, and so on. It works with web workers and has great support if we're talking about web browsers, so that's why we use it quite often. Another necessary API when you create progressive web apps and if you want to use offline first is cache API. It was created to enable service worker to cache network requests. It allows you to store pairs of requests and responses that represents HTTP requests and responses respectively. However, the requests and responses can contain any kind of data that can be transferred over HTTP. And what we do in offline first, so typically for the network resources that are necessary to load your app, while offline we use cache API as a part of service worker. But for all other data, we use index database with a promises wrapper. And it's good to know that sometimes using raw index database can be complicated for some cases. And we know other tools, JavaScript libraries that are wrappers for index database, that are just more developer-friendly solutions that allows you to use this storage easier. And today I will tell you more about PouchDB, but you should remember that you have more options. You can use also Dexy.js, JSTore, local forage, and so on. storage has own limits, and it depends on the browser. But the general rule is that your browser is able to store your data until the browser quota is reached. And if you want to check how much quota is already used in your app, you can use Quota Management API. But here you can see how it is for different browsers. So in Chrome, you're able to use up to 6% of free disk space. In Firefox, the limit is 10% of free disk space. For Safari, this is just a number. This is 50 megabytes, and this case is for mobile browsers. But for desktop, it's unlimited. For Internet Explorer, this is also just a number. It's 250 megabytes. But for Edge, it depends on volume size. And I will tell you about PouchDB, but in general, it tracks index database storages. So if you want to check how much you can store there, you should check what are storage limits for index database. And if you open Chrome, Developer Tools, and the tab Application, you're able to follow what kind of data is stored in different types of these storages. This is an example for Twitter, because this is my favorite progressive web app, and I highly recommend you to check it and to verify what kind of data is stored in different storages, and also what are their sizes. And I think this is the most effective progressive web app I've seen, so you should check it out. Now I will introduce you PouchDB. This is a technology that enables you to build apps that will store the data on the front end and synchronize it with the backend automatically. PouchDB, this is a JavaScript database. It runs in the browser. It's open source, and it's great because it runs everywhere where JavaScript runs. So you can use it with your web apps, but also it's possible to apply it with hybrid apps. If you're using PhoneGap or Cordova, you can apply it into desktop apps if you're using Electron, or also with server app with Node.js. This is an example architecture, how you can structure your app. You have front-end side, and in this case I will use Angular, but you can use any front-end solution. We will store our data in PouchDB. We will save it locally. But on the backend side, we will use CouchDB because it's compatible with PouchDB, and you're able to replicate and synchronize really easy. So if we will have our data stored locally, then we need to hook it up with the backend for replication. We will send this data remotely to the backend side. The cool thing about PouchDB is that it can subscribe these changes automatically, and if anything changes on the backend side, it will push to the front end, and we can easily subscribe it, handle our data, refresh, and show to the user current version of your app. Now I want to show you how you can apply it inside your app. And I will show you the example of Angular, but the most important is to catch the idea. How to apply PouchDB, what are necessary steps to handle your data, and then you can apply it into your any app, into your any project. So first of all, we should render your app while offline. And to do that, we need Cache API, and we need Service Worker. In Angular app, the easiest options is to generate files necessary for PWA with command ng-add. But if you use other framework solution, you can implement service worker on your own. And this is example. So you need to define your cache and also resources you want to cache. The basic body of service worker is just implementation with handling events for service worker. Because service worker is just a JavaScript that is run in your browser, is registered when you open it for the first time. And it's necessary file if you want to run your app and allows your user use it while offline. Then if our app works, if it's offline, it renders, we can apply PouchDB and handle our dynamic data. So we can use node and npm install command. For current version is PouchDB browser, and if you want to use it in your frontend app, you need to import it to get the instance of PouchDB. We'll create our local database. In this case, this is a database called my local database, and it's important that you need on the backend side the solution that is compatible with PouchDB. So as I showed you at the scheme that it was CouchDB, but you can also use, for example, PouchDB server. It's another solution you can apply when you use offline first. Then we need to hook it up with the backend for replication. We'll use method sync. We'll add remote database, the URL to your remote database, and the solution is compatible with PouchDB. And we also need to define type of replication. In this example, we can see bidirectional replication because we set two parameters, live and retry on true. If your databases are replicated, you can subscribe changes on front-end side and just react on these changes. For example, to refresh your data, refresh your app, and it really depends on your app. It's not universal, let's say, method, but it depends on you what you want to do when you get these changes. So that was the main idea, and as I told you, you can apply it to any front-end solution, but you need to know how to do that and need to know about the solutions that are compatible and allows you to synchronize with the backend automatically and store easily on the front-end side. Now I want to tell you about the app shell model. It's a way to render a portion of your app via a route at build time. It can improve the user experience by quickly launching a static render page. And while the browser downloads the full client version, it will switch to this automatically after the code loads. And this is just a skeleton common to all pages. It's the minimal HTML, CSS, and JavaScript required to power the user interface of your app. And it's really good. You can get really good performance to users on repeat visits because these parts are typically involved with navigation and are repeated for most of your pages in your app. Angular gives you a really simple way to generate the app shell. You can use the only one command, this is ng-generate app shell, and you need to add two properties. The first one, this is the name of your client app. The second is the name of universal app or just server. And if you run it, then you will see changes in your Angular.js configuration file, and specifically you will get 2 new targets that are necessary to create this app shell for your progressive web app. Next step is building. So you should apply command ng-run, and depends on environment. If you want to use it for the production, the second case is for you. And app shell is a way to render a portion of your app via a route at build time. And it can improve the user experience because your browser can simply render the HTML and CSS without the need to initialize any JavaScript, because the rendering web apps in your browsers is specifically involved with rendering JavaScript that can be just sometimes a costful, let's say, process. And I did the tests, and I created progressive web apps in Angular and also created the app shell for the same progressive web app. And I tried to refresh these apps 10 times, and here you can see the visual effect. The goal is to show you rendering time. So the app, with the app shell, you even can't get that you have any delay in rendering, but you've seen small difference for the same app without the app shell. Let's take a look at results of performance tests. Well, I tested 5 metrics for these apps I presented you before. And I tested load time, first byte, start render, first contentful paint, and speed index. And here you can see what you can achieve if you apply the app shell. For each of these performance metrics, we get over 20% of better performance tests. Now I want to show you example apps that were created with offline first. This is Hospital, it's my favorite. This is open source app for developing with hospitals. It were used, for example, in Kenya. So the doctor were able to take this app into places without the internet connection. He could collect this data, and when he had internet access again, all these data were synchronized with our clients. It's open source and it's easy to find it on GitHub. Another case for more personal usage, this is Cozy Cloud. It is personal cloud that can synchronize contacts, calendar, files, and share it between your personal devices and server. And also Financer, also let's say personal app that allows you to store your budget data. And it's important to remember that these offline first apps quite often inspire our mobile apps. So these offline functionalities we do similarly to native apps. It's time for summary. So today I told you about offline first approach, and I highly recommend you to try it. Maybe it's good to you for your case in your app to apply it. Please remember that you don't need to use raw offline storages. You can, for example, try PouchDB, that is more developer-friendly solution. And also remember that offline first allows you to create fast and stable app when the network isn't, but also it's a great way to save the world from sadness. That's all from my side. Thanks for having me. If you have any questions, feel free to ping me.